Hello, Psych 101, Sections 5 and 6, Spring 2020, Lincoln University, Missouri, Dr. Johnson, Psych 1 sections. This is the fourth and the last presentation over the set of PowerPoints, the five-factor model, Psych 101, Part 2 PowerPoints. And in this presentation, we're going to be going over what you see as slides 33 through 37. So in the last two presentations, we talked about what do the um, five main factors tend to predict. What has research showed us about the validity of those five factors? What do those five factors mean? What is it that they measure? And the stuff we're talking about in this presentation is related. Um, And there's really two main points that lead me to talk about this. And the first one is that over the years, as I've looked at dozens and dozens of people's reports back from taking the IP Neo online, either the 120 or the longer one, is that I have noticed, well, okay, first, in general, in terms of the way the measurement is put together, it would make sense to expect that if the facet scores are subdivisions of the major factor, and remember the way that the facet scores were arrived at is we did the factor analysis for the big five factors, then we took all the items, all the questions that the factor analysis sorted into each of the factor, and we factor analyzed just them, and then got breakdowns, more nuanced breakdowns. So in general, it would make sense to find that individual factor scores generally cluster within 10 to 15 percentile points around the mean of the main factor. So if we go back and look at our illustration of the normal distribution, let's say for instance we've been talking about, let's say we've got somebody who's got a factor score on extroversion of 30. And so for the 6 facet scores under extroversion, we would, and let's go look at those real quick. Friendliness, gregariousness, assertiveness, activity level, excitement seeking, and cheerfulness. Generally, we would expect that if their overall extroversion score is 30, that most of their facet scores would be between 15 and 45. But that's not always the case. And there are a couple of different reasons why this might be, and I want to address both of them. The first one is that even though our overall tendency on a factor may be to be relatively high or relatively low, on certain kinds of facets, due to personal life experience, I think some people's scores get skewed by what life has taught them through experience. And the second thing to think about, and this goes back to when we were talking about, remember when we were talking about extroversion, we said that there's the first way that we tend to think about extroversion is a preference for lots of social interaction with lots of different people versus sort of being more medium or low on extroversion, but that the core aspect of extroversion is a preference for a greater overall level of stimulation from the environment. So if one particular explanation for why we get the different facets and scores is that sometimes personal life experience teaches us particular things. The second is that each factor represents to some degree a combination of more nuanced expressions. And when we get to the extroversion facets, we'll look at like, okay, so we've got the you want to be around people, but you also want stimulation from the environment. And this will show up in a couple of the different facets. A couple of the different factors in terms of their facets. Another thing to keep in mind about the facet scores. So the particular 5-factor model questionnaire that we filled out was the IP-IP-NEO 120. And if you go to Dr. Johnson's IP-IP-NEO website, you'll see that there's a longer version that you can take that's got more questions. And one of the advantages of taking the version with the larger amount of questions is that it's sort of more questions if they're grouped correctly, chosen correctly, and then statistically they show a particular set of characteristics. More questions give us a little bit more guard against error, that like we never measure anything exactly. There's always a little bit of error. We're getting an approximate score. So for the IP-IP-NEO, you answered 120 questions. And there's 5 main factors. So if you've got 120 questions and 5 main factors, then you've got... So then we went in and we factor analyzed the relationships between people's responses to those 24 items, and we came up with 6 different facets. And that means that with just a 120 question and 6 times 5 facets, or 30 total different facet scores, we've got 4 items per facet. And the questions that key on each individual facet have been chosen carefully, and we've looked at relationships between people's scores. But the fact of the matter is that when we're talking about psychological measurement, when we get to as few as 4 items, we've got just a few items per thing we're trying to measure, then that increases the chance of error. So overall, we've got 3 different things that are affecting facet scores and how they are or are not related to factor scores. One is life experience, graffiti-like, the crude graffiti-like nature of the notes. The second is factors are composed of a set of tendencies within us that seem to group together. Factors are complex. And the third is error, which with the facet scores is liable to be a little higher because we've only got 4 items per facet. And the 2 facet scores under agreeableness that I most want to talk about are the trust scores, the scores on the trust facet, and the scores on the morality facet. Because what I've observed through the years is that in terms of like people who have uh, average to above, getting to above average scores on agreeableness, sometimes have really low comparatively scores on trust and morality. Another issue that we're dealing with is that I'm not certain that the names that have been assigned to the facets in this particular measurement of the five factors completely communicates what those scores are about. So if we go and look at what the test report readout, if we go and look at what the test report readout has to say about agreeableness, excuse me just a second. Yeah, I wanted to make sure something. So what the interpretations you got if you took the test say is that a person with high trust assumes most people are fair, honest, and have good intentions. And persons low in trust see others as selfish, devious, and potentially dangerous. So sometimes people who have relatively high levels of agreeableness have relatively, like really low levels of trust. And then the second one I want to look at in terms of agreeableness is morality. And here's one where I'm not necessarily sure that the word that they chose particularly fits my definition of morality, but people who have high scores on this facet see no need for pretense or manipulation when dealing with others and are therefore candid, frank, and sincere. On the other hand, low scorers believe that a certain amount of deception in social relationships is necessary. So if your score in morality is higher than average, other people tend to experience you as easy to relate with and straightforward in terms of your interactions with them. On the other hand, if your score on morality is relatively low, other people, when they're dealing with you, may find it more difficult to relate. It's like I'm not sure how to make sense of this person. Can I really depend on what they tell me about what they intend and what they want to do? And if they tell me good things about myself, can I really depend that they mean them and mean them in my best intention? Or if they tell me bad things about myself, are they really being straightforward with me? Or maybe they're gaslighting me and telling me things that are untrue about myself. So one of the things that's important about how the report that the test site gives you is it's made clear that low scores are not necessarily unprincipled or immoral. They're just more guarded. They're more cautious about openly revealing the whole truth about themselves or the situation that they're in. So one of the things, as I've looked at the fact that more often than almost any of the other facets for any of the other factors, is that people who have average to above average scores on the overall agreeableness facet may have low trust and may have low morality. And I think that that's often because the experience of their own particular path through life has shown them that other people don't always treat you in a straightforward fashion and can't be accepted at face value. And sometimes in terms of this morality, which is kind of the other thing, it's like if trust is you think other people are going to be straightforward with you, morality is about being I'm going to have the confidence to be straightforward with you. And people who have low scores on this may have been taught by experience that sometimes in certain situations there are times when you really kind of have to bend the truth in order to um, not just advance, but even survive and keep on going. So now we turn to the others, and for the other factors, I think the facets, differences in facet scores are not so much reflective of differences in people's life experiences as they sort of give evidence to the fact that these factors, even though we can sort into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 big factors, uh, each of them is kind of put together from bits and pieces that are a little bit more nuanced. So thinking about extroversion, we said the first thing about extroversion is people who are high in extroversion want more social interaction with more people. And then the second thing about extroversion was that the more basic core experience of extroversion may have to do with desiring, in order to kind of like reach a comfortable baseline, needing more stimulation from the environment than people who have average scores or low scores. And we sort of see this when we start to look at the difference, like what do the different extroversion facets describe? So assertiveness is like you're a person, if you're in a situation where like, ooh, like somebody needs to step up and take charge in this situation, you're that person, especially if it involves standing up for yourself. So a certain amount of assertiveness, being able to stand up for yourself and make sure you don't get treated badly is important. It's something you could argue you owe it to yourself. Gregariousness, on the other hand, is wanting to be around people. So gregariousness is about wanting the stimulation that comes up from being around other people. That's one of the core things about extroversion. You want to be around other people. But remember, if you're high on extroversion and want to be around other people, that's not the same thing as you're high on agreeableness and other people want to be around you. So in terms of that two parts to extroversion, wanting to be around other people and wanting stimulation from the environment, the activity level score is more about like, oh, I want things to be happening. Activity level is more about the overall preferred level of stimulation from the environment. How vigorous does it require you to be in your interaction with the environment? And then finally, think about the difference between, what's the difference between cheerfulness and gregariousness? Gregariousness is more about wanting to be around people, while cheerfulness is more about the value you put in having positive experiences with other people. Giving friendliness out, getting friendliness back. Conscientiousness, again, it's put together from bits and pieces. One of the things that we said was an advantage about being high in conscientiousness is that other people see you as someone who is competent and get things done when they say that they're going to. Um, your reputation for competence is dependent on your display of competent behavior. So one part of that is keeping things in order, and if we keep things in order, it's easier to put them together and get things done. And then the related but not exactly the same idea of self-discipline, that people who are high in self-discipline put a priority on keeping things in order and getting things done when they promise themselves or others that they're going to get them done. Conscientiousness. Okay, so one of the facets for conscientiousness is achievement striving. So it may be that any one of us is naturally talented in a certain area of life. There's some things that come easy to us that don't necessarily come easy to others. People who get really accomplished at something, whether they have a natural talent at it or whether they don't have much talent, but they purposefully practice skills to get better at it. If you're not, even if you're talented or if you're not talented, if you're really accomplished, it pretty much depends on the fact that you practice with intention. You make up your mind to get better. You go through exercises to help you get better. And you somehow or another mark your progress. So people who are high on achievement striving both want to actually be accomplished, and they also want to be recognized and perceived by others as being accomplished. It's related, but it's not exactly the same. Self-efficacy. It might be that you have a lot of desire to be accomplished, but you don't necessarily have confidence that you are. So self-efficacy is your belief about how well your practice to be accomplished has paid off. You actually do have the skills and abilities to meet certain situations in an above average way to compare to folks in the great big sample of everybody. And then finally, and I think this is going to be related to extroversion, people who are high on the stimulation seeking part of extroversion may be a little bit less cautious. People who are high in cautiousness don't want to take any risks that aren't completely necessary, and if they decide they do want to take those risks, they take them after putting themselves in the position to be most assured that that risk will pay off. Finally, we get to the neuroticism facets. So in the third presentation in this series of 4 about the 5-factor model part 2 slides, we talked about the diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, psychiatric, psychological disorders, published by the American Psychiatric Association. And one of the things that was mentioned is that by itself, having high neuroticism scores on a 5-factor measure doesn't mean that you necessarily are qualified for a diagnosis. But there's some diagnostic categories that it just makes sense to assume that people who are constitutionally, because their nervous systems are more sensitive to punishment, and it's easier to make them feel punished and unhappy, is that people who are higher in neuroticism are more likely to, at some point in their life, qualify for diagnoses, and that's especially going to be true in the anxiety disorders and the depressive disorders. So there's a lot of reasons, there's a lot of good reasons to argue that anxiety and depression are not the same thing. And then we've got this other one, anger. What kinds of things tend to make us angry? And one part of the answer to the question, what kinds of things make us angry, are things that make us scared tend to also make us angry. We get mad at things that frighten us. We get mad at things that threaten us. So these are the three core negative emotions. They're related. They're not exactly the same. So one of the things is that if you've got, at this point in your life, a relatively high score on the anxiety facet, but not so much on the depression facet, learn to watch out, because even though these are not the same things, we know that over the span of your whole entire life, if you've got relatively increased anxiety, that increases the chance that you'll at some point experience depression. So if these are the three basic core negative emotions, what do we make of self-consciousness? Well, self-consciousness, higher self-consciousness is about more sort of like thinking about and being concerned with other people's reactions to you, especially if other people have negative reactions to you. So if you have had, this is another sort of life experience one, if you have been around a lot of people who were chronically critical of you, and maybe that chronic criticism isn't really warranted by your actual behavior, it can lead us to be particularly worried or particularly concerned with how other people evaluate us. And partly that's because, like, ooh, our previous experiences, that negative evaluation leads to anxiety or anger or depression. And then finally, the last two facets we're talking about in neuroticism, vulnerability. So all of us experience stressful experiences, but people who are relatively high in vulnerability, it's like stressful experiences, if someone's relatively high in vulnerability, it's easier for them, for those stressful experiences, to trigger those three core negative emotions. How much does that take you off track? How much does that kind of knock you out of a centered, productive place? And one thing to think about vulnerability, this is really important in terms of having rewarding interpersonal relations, is that rewarding interpersonal relations really involves risk, taking risk, exposing aspects of yourself that other people may not react to positively. And do they give you a negative reaction, or do they give you a positive reaction? So people who are relatively high in vulnerability, interpersonal risks especially may seem particularly difficult. But if you're going to, over the long term, have really satisfying relationships with people, you kind of have to do it. Finally, in moderation. So the IP-IPNEO report talks about a moderation being somebody has relatively less control of behavior that is the result of behavior that is the result of urgings or cravings for things that might not necessarily be good for us. They might not be good for us, but they might help soothe the three core negative emotions. So if we are relatively high in terms of our experiences to in terms of our tendency to experience anxiety, anger, and depression, we may be attracted by things like too much food, too much alcohol, too much other kinds of drugs, in order to turn down the relative discomfort that we experience. And for those of us who are high in moderation, that's something over the whole entire course of our lives. It's like you kind of got to watch. Okay, so we're at the end of our discussion of the five-factor model and what the five factors, how we got to the five factors, why it makes sense to get to five factors, generally what the five factors predict, and then what are the more nuanced details of what goes into making up the five factors. We will continue to talk about some of the things we've been talking about in the presentations over this two set of slides when we begin looking at the slides for Dr. Panksepp's 7 basic affects model. All right. Have a great afternoon, day, morning, evening, whenever you are.